One of the big features of the Age of War Chapter 2 is the loot rework. Conan Exiles is all about clearing dungeons, cutting through camps and building up your own empire, but for years now the loot hasn't really matched up. In the words of Dennis, the lead designer, loot is frankly boring and often doesn't make sense. This rework aims to change that, revamping all the loot tables, but does it get the job done? Today we'll be taking on 3 different pieces of content to see how the loot rework has shifted things around. So let's begin at the home of my favourite character in the game, the Black Keep. I've only ran this dungeon a few times before, so I did end up getting a little bit lost, but the overall clear probably took about 10 minutes. You'll also get to see a little bit of the dungeon changes in this segment, which I'll also give my own opinion on here. The Black Keep might be a bad example of the dungeon changes, as it's a pretty inflexible area. There isn't really much space for additional bosses or new areas, so the new changes are very trap reliant. Those traps, however, are pretty good. Most of them are just spike traps, carefully hidden around blind spots or in the shadows. If you run dungeons regularly, you'll quickly get used to it, but being caught off guard the first few times is pretty good. There is also one really devious trap that springs you up to a hidden compartment, but if you walk towards the chest, your head gets perforated by spikes. Sneaky, I like it. The loot in here though is something else. This is obviously a dungeon closer towards the end game as opposed to something like the dregs, so the loot will be better by virtue, but the difference between the live game and the beta is pretty obvious. In the live server, loot here was somewhat useful. Iron bars, bones, bark, that sort of thing, nothing to really write home about. Now, however, it is generally a lot more useful for the stage of the game you'd expect to be in when you're taking on the Black Keep. Right at the top of the dungeon is, of course, the Kinscourge himself. Now, the fight with him hasn't been changed, but the loot he drops in his inventory has also been changed for the better. He does, of course, still give the main quest items when you harvest his body. There's also legendary chests on either side of the chamber next to the statues for a total of 4 rolls on the legendary table every time you clear the dungeon. I gotta say, this plays really nicely into the whole reward feeling of the dungeon. The new loot offers some good stuff, but even if you did get unlucky and didn't get too much, you're still guaranteed 4 legendaries as long as you've bought enough skeleton keys. This was the total loot from the Black Keep. Honestly, pretty good. It's definitely a big improvement over the loot currently in the live servers, and I think it makes the effort of actually going through these dungeons worth it, especially considering the legendary chests at the end of every dungeon. For our second location, let's head over to New Azagarth. This is also going to be a good spot to test the loot localization. As Dennis mentioned in the dev stream, it didn't really make sense for Vanir to be dropping Dafari items or for Stygians to be dropping Lemurian stuff, so loot is now localised to the areas you find it in terms of it drops according to the culture. Seeing as New Azagarth is populated with Nordheimers, we should expect to see more Nord loot and definitely no Dafari clothing or Stygian weapons or stuff like that. As I'm cutting through this camp, the difference in loot is noticeable. New Azagarth is not the easiest camp to clear in the game, but it's also not the hardest, and the loot suits that well. There's a surprising number of weapons and gear that you could either use or just disassemble for some fairly good returns. I also noticed other useful loot like fur, healing items, food, gold and silver, and just generally a bunch of items that I don't really want to leave on the ground. There's even stuff like thick hides and ivory, which is far more useful than the stuff these guys dropped before. This is the total loot from my trip to New Azagarth, where I cleared the entire interior of the camp. I did spot some loot chests which are different from regular or wooden chests which were unfortunately empty. I'm pretty sure this is a bug, so I have reported it, and hopefully it's just an oversight that gets fixed. I also decided to put all the loot I didn't want through the dismantling bench to see what raw materials I'd get. Dismantling has apparently received a buff, so it'll be interesting to see. In the end, from that single run, I got some decent resources. There was of course a little bit of stone and plant fibre, but 89 hardened steel and 12 star metal is not bad at all. Finally, let's head over to a more early game location, which will be the Dogs of the Desert camp near the Hand of the Maker. This is a really easy camp to work through, not too many enemies, but I'm also not expecting much in the way of loot. However, that being said, I was pleasantly surprised. The camp is very early game and the loot does suit that, but I think the loot here is perhaps even more valuable as it can really help in that early game phase. This is the total loot I got from the Hand of the Maker. There are some less useful stuff like banners, candles, etc, but there's also gold and silver coins, food, some armour and weapons, and some resources like hide, bricks and chitin. I didn't really expect much from this camp, but I was pleasantly surprised. Not much useful here if you are towards the end game, but seeing as this camp is in such an early game location, the loot is very fitting. Overall, the loot rework so far is really good. From what I've experienced thus far, the devs have done a great job with this feature. Loot makes sense and it's actually valuable loot you'd want to pick up. I remember playing PvE before and after a certain point I'd just leave most loot on the ground because it wasn't really worth picking up, and I definitely never really felt impressed with the loot I got. However, that's definitely different now, and the rewards you get feel like an actual reward rather than just a token offering because you did a thing. Overall, a pretty big change, but definitely a very good one. And there we have it, a look at the new loot rework coming to Conan in the Age of War Chapter 2. Thanks for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. I'll be covering other things from this update soon, like the Purge rework, and I'll be looking at the changes to dungeons in a bit more depth soon too. Again, thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.